We need to talk about something interesting.
Perhaps you've heard that brevity is the soul of wit. William Shakespeare said that in Hamlet. And I bet you're wondering if I'm going to compare Tatsuki Fujimoto to William Shakespeare on the level of writing efficacy, and you're goddamn right I am. The best writer since Shakespeare released a manga in 2019, a one-shot, only 144 pages, a very short story, many of it without dialogue. And that manga was adapted into one of the best anime films I have seen, right up there with The Disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya, as well as The Adolescence of Utena. Walking out of the theater after seeing Look Back in 2024 in Japan, I made a promise with myself and with everyone that I would eventually talk about this film on my channel. And I thought it deserved the type of long-form critical analysis that I first cut my teeth doing. So, once again, in spite of promises that I'd made to never do this ever again, I hope you'll all join me as we talk about the film Look Back. Let's ignore the name of the film until it comes up in the title card later. Let's also bring up the extra diegetic backstory of Fujimoto, the semi-autobiographical nature of the film, and the themes of the film when they become more relevant and when we see them in the story. The only other person I want to mention at the start of the film, as right away we see his decisions, is the director and creative lead, Kiyotaka Oshiyama. Not a name that many of you will recognize, unless of course you are a big Magical Girl fan like myself, and understand him as the director of Flip Flappers, a show that I included in my tier list and ranked highly recommended for anyone really, but specifically Magical Girl fans as well. Oshiyama is an animator primarily and did the animation direction as well as directing this film, and presumably storyboarding on this film, though there are no storyboarding credits listed. Regardless, his name is all over the place on this film, and it appears that he was entirely the creative lead. So here's your challenge. While Flip Flappers was an anime original and could be taken in any way and stretched in any way, which it most certainly was if you know the ending of that show, instead with Look Back you have 144 pages, again many without any dialogue, to adapt into a feature-length film. It's really good content, but it needs a bit of embellishment. It needs choices. It needs an adaptation. So while this manga, as you can clearly see here, begins right at the first scene in school, the anime adaptation of Look Back begins somewhere else. And it's a very, very interesting choice. The first 3 minutes of the film Look Back are completely original and based only on the cover. Oshiyama gives us a shot of the night moon, something that is not a large symbol in the story itself and not in the original as stated. The camera pans and spins and zooms in as it falls like a comet down from the sky onto the desk of Fujino, where she's writing the comic for tomorrow and the school paper. There's a couple things we can immediately notice here. First is the literal context of what we are seeing. Fujino is up late at night. She spends a number of minutes struggling to figure out how to produce the comic that she's working on. This shows her as diligent, as someone who cares about what she is doing, as an artist, something we'll talk about over the course of this breakdown. Symbolically, we have two very strong associated references here. The first is the comic that she is drawing that we will later see includes an asteroid falling to Earth, and indeed a reverse shot of the shot we get here plunging down into Earth as the woman looks up to the asteroid that is falling on her in the comic. The second reference is of course also very strong if you've seen the film. You'll know that the cover of Look Back, the shot of Fujino from behind working at a desk, is the exact final shot of Look Back. This of course gives us some degree of capstoning or closure when the story is finished, but it also tells us what doesn't change. When something is said up front and then shown again after all these events of the drama that happens over the story, then you know that that's something that is above that drama, or that is beyond being affected by the events of the story. Fujino is an artist. She is a creative. And the act of creating that we are introduced here in the first 3 minutes, and the tone that comes along with it, which we will certainly talk about when we address the music, that all remains the same, despite the trials and tribulations that she goes through. And this kind of informs what the movie wants to say about art and the creation of art, and what Fujimoto is trying to convey in his experiences being an artist, as this film is somewhat semi-autobiographical. Time will go on, things will happen, and you will change. But at the same time, the purity, the platonic ideal of expressing yourself as an artist, that does not change. Let's also consider this shot practically. Oshiyama is indeed an art director. He has worked on everything from, yes, Chainsaw Man, all the way up to key animation for things like Space Dandy, Den-O Coil, or the Evangelion rebuilds. I guarantee you that Oshiyama is well aware that this is far, far harder and more animation than is needed for this scene. If you've ever tried any type of animation yourself, or are familiar with anime production in general, you should know that some shots are more difficult to animate than other shots. Specifically, anime uses many tracking or panning shots, where either the character runs along with movement in the background, or the characters stand still on screen and talk to each other, or the camera turns and follows something. However, to convey movement like this, like we see in the first scene of Look Back, it requires a very intense level of artistry and production resources to get this effect. It's very specifically something that was used in Akira, and in hand-drawn animation takes so much time because you have to animate every frame by frame as you dolly shot and zoom in down a hallway or something. Every single frame needs to be adjusted because the perspective of the camera is moving closer and closer to where it's going. So everything on the screen, the characters, the backgrounds, everything needs to be readjusted, zoomed in, and then redrawn completely from scratch. For this reason alone, hand-drawn animation almost never has dolly shots like this. In fact, one of the primary uses of CGI animation and the strengths that it has is being able to do action shots like this, something you can see in Studio Orange's work with Land of the Lustrous or Trigun Stampede. So the fourth level of consuming this, I don't know what the previous three were, maybe something we talked about earlier, but I like to consider this the fourth level of something that you're getting out of the start of Look Back, is the fact that we know that this is tough. We know that this is an animation flex, and we're showing it off right here, right at the start, with the twisting, turning, falling. Replicating something like a drone shot when there's no inherent need. But perhaps that's being dismissive, because I think that there's another reading on this drone shot to open the show, this dolly shot of animation extravagance, let's say. My primary and preferred reading of why this first 3 minutes of Look Back exists is as a metaphor for inspiration. I like the idea that somehow the concept for the strip that Fujino is drawing originated far outside of herself. You know, you could have made the first 3 minutes side of her brain, or like a metaphor for that, or something maybe like Pompo the Cinephile does in its cinematic editing concepts. But no, We are literally starting in the night sky. We are disoriented as the camera flips around. Which way is up? Where are we going? What are the shapes that is forming? And that strikes me, somebody who is not inherently that creative, that reminds me of creativity in the best way. And how ideas kind of form and coalesce together. Even the things that I'm saying right now feel like something that comes from beyond me or in the ethereal space of ideation and this thought cloud, and then it coalesces into something and arrives to me and through me. I have no real idea what Oshiyama was going for on this one, but the author is dead. It doesn't really matter one way or the other. I think the really strong reading that comes across is one of introspection, and I think that's very much enforced by the tone here. The night sky and seeing this and being a little confused about what's going on and what the movie's about if you don't already come in with the context behind it. Seeing this long, protracted 2 minutes of just the back of one character and just the small subtleties of them working on something. We don't even know what it is at this point. This is forcing you to be reflective, to be silent, to be reverent. And I think it's also informing you of what the movie's going to do vis-a-vis the montage sequences later on, but it's also prepping you for the type of film that you are about to experience. And that film is going to be focused on subtleties. It's going to be focused on nonverbals. And it's going to be focused on paying tribute to the sanctity of creation and collaboration. Because for what this scene is also, it is completely solitary. And that's the large part of the first idea Look Back explores, is your own internal efforts combined with someone else's, or the progeny that can come from collaboration. So we have to first set Fujino up as solitary in her creative efforts. But while that maybe sounds bad, the final thing that is in this 3-minute sequence is the background music. For a movie that is so without dialogue in so many places, and so sparse, intentionally so, in what is said, the music is an active part of informing the viewer how they are to consume certain scenes, and what intention is behind this art in specific. And this, of course, is not something Fujimoto did at all. This is all from Oshiyama. Of course, that's unfair. It's much more towards Haruka Nakamura, who is the composer for Look Back, and hasn't really done any other anime aside from the openings and endings to Trigun Stampede. Nakamura's music is, how best to describe it? It's very lush and very delicate. And it certainly evokes some things that are dreamlike in the melodies. It gives the feeling, I think, of introspection and tranquility, especially in this opening scene of Look Back. You know intuitively, without any type of conditioning or other word-based understanding, that this is a positive thing that we are looking at. This solitude is not bad in any way, because Nakamura makes it feel so positive and, almost sacrosanct. Almost like this is a religious act that Fujino is doing. This scene is also conditioning you as the viewer, like we said earlier, to accept this as something that is valid in the storytelling for the rest of the film. So many of the shots in Look Back are going to be these visual montages with Nakamura's backing of the music, creating content. And that seems weird, right? Like, the story isn't progressing as such, like quote unquote, but Nakamura's music makes it feel like actual content. Like I am sitting through the scene to hear the music specifically, which is incredibly odd, and not in any way the traditional way to use background music in anime. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of amazing background music in anime, but rarely does background music ever become the focus of the scene, which the subtleties of the movement and the long shots really allow it to be in this movie, and also specifically in this first scene. Moving on, I am proven an idiot and a liar as the title screen comes up and announces the title of the film, Look Back, in this same shot. I thought for sure that happened at the end of the film, but I am completely wrong. So, I don't know, maybe I'll still save the Look Back title discussion for later on, because I don't think it's clear right now. We get the mirror, so you can see a bit of Fujino's face, and she does turn around as the strip is finished and the scene ends, but the ideas behind Look Back go so far past that it really bears heavier discussion once we get into the specifics of the events that occur in the story. And then we transition into Fujino's first comic in the story, something that a lot of people were looking forward to after reading the manga and seeing how they would adapt these comics into animation. And to the credit of Oshiyama, he absolutely did change the art style, get all these fantastic, fun qualities in here. It's looking like Shin-chan out here all of a sudden. And it's very reflective of exactly the same type of thing he did on Flip Flapper, so not surprising at all. But before we get too deep into that, I want to use this to express one of the things I've written down as a cohesive theme of Look Back and how it's explored. And first, what we see here. Because I love Fujimoto so much for being able to do this and being able to accurately get across this type of narrative levels, that the story could be engaging with stories on its own level, and inside the story we have a nested story, and how can we use that to talk about things in general. And I talked about this a lot in my Madoka Magica breakdown of these different levels of diegesis and interacting with the storytelling elements in a story itself. But Fujimoto's just the master at it, and I think Oshiyama really keyed in on this as an element to get across by seamlessly kind of transitioning into these fantastical, clearly animated comics. But the idea is that in some way Fujino is using this story to express reality, or to express herself on reality. I think that the way an artist does that, the way an artist actualizes themselves through their art, and their art becomes a part of them, is so crucial to the ideas behind Look Back and what Fujimoto is trying to say about being an artist. But then also, how you deal with things in real life. And that's the beautiful part about Look Back, is that we see a bit of confusion when the drama happens much later in the film. We are taken on this kind of fantastical romp, this idea of we're not sure which way's up, just like the opening shot, spinning around, confused, where is it going, what is real? And that way of expressing the tumultuous nature of trauma, it feels so true to what an artist is and what they do and how they cope with their world. So in this first kind of idea of breaking the linearity or the scope of the clearly normal world and a normal Japanese desk in the modern times, and going straight into this fantasy, we're eased in here. We clearly see that it is a comic, a 4-koma that she just drew, so it's not too wild, but it is again priming us for what happens later in the film. That it's going to come in and it's going to challenge us to determine fiction from reality, or use this fiction as perhaps a coping mechanism for what's going on in reality, with big scare quotes on it. I talked about this in my Beautiful Fighting Girl video. You should definitely go watch that. It was one of my best. This idea of differing realities and engaging with them. The fun nature of this first one, and Fujino's reception and the praise that we see after the scene really clues us into the positive aspects of that. And then Perhaps in other times with the Don't Come Out manga or 4-koma, we get this idea of like how else it can be used. This idea of fiction as embracing a different reality. That's a lot of words. Let's get into it. Also, are you paying attention here? Do we see the symbol of the wind blowing the 4-koma strip? Again, like something that comes back at the end of the film, all throughout the film. The idea that it's like the wind slightly giving life to these comics, right? Or giving them importance. I don't know, the wind, kind of an abstract symbol that we'll get to later, and possibly could be why we started outside and came in. But it's certainly something that comes up again and again, repeated symbol. And also this kind of zoom in, dolly in shot that is hard to animate into this comic book world. Because we were just brought into this world in exactly the same motion. It gives us the same, not only respect for this story that we are a viewer of, you know, this 4-koma story that we would have for this full-length animated movie, but it also informs us that the characters have that same appeal to their fiction in their story. Like, this fiction matters as much to them as the look-back movie does to us. Which is hilarious, because now we are in, like, this, as previously stated, Shin-chan-esque animation, and this absurdity of this, traffic accident story. That you have this crash, this, like, hyper-violence, and the comedy found therein. Which, of course, this brings up the Tatsuki Fujimoto autobiographical angle, and this is one of the one places where we see it very clearly, right? That Fujimoto has a very distinct absurdist style to his stories, that in stuff like Chainsaw Man and Fire Punch, there's extreme violence, but then there's also there's this witty kind of joking tongue-in-cheek humor that's played off a lot of the time with that. Because we know that Fujino is going to be absolutely the stand-in for Fujimoto in this story, we can kind of understand that this is Fujimoto saying, yeah, I was always doing this. I always had this type of humor in my mind, this type of absurdity in my storytelling. And he wasn't afraid to use that type of extremity to get there and show that as absurd. Like, this is a 4th grader making a story for the public school paper, you know, and having this type of violent content. I can tell you, I worked for my school paper, and if this type of thing was put in there, it would absolutely be censored out. So it's just really cool to either see whether that's a cultural difference in Japan, or that's, you know, Fujimoto saying that's like how he understood everything even back in the day. It's just a really cool reference. Other than that, it's what you would expect from animating that 4-comic panel, right? It's Oshiyama's interpretation of it, but I think it's very true to what that comic would be animated as. And sure, it's embellished, like, we don't see the girl grow up over the different years in the original 4-panel comic, but the idea of the joke is still there, and again, as previously mentioned, we have this zoom-out shot in reverse. So we can kind of contextualize the zoom-in, zoom-out dolly shots as entering and exiting fictional narratives. I mean, there's a couple quotes from Oshiyama talking about the film, and a lot of them are in line with what I've already talked about and will continue to talk about. But one I like to bring up here when we're talking about adapting these 4-koma, he said, adaptation isn't about replication. It's about finding equivalencies in a new medium. And that's what I like to think about when seeing this animation style. Like, you get it, right? You get the joke, and you see how it is done. And through this, you can very easily understand that the, what do you want to call it, visual acuity? That's a bad word. The realism of the art style is nowhere near what we would qualify as good enough for production. Right? And that leads into the first initial conflict of the film. But before we get there, and before we talk about like artists and improving and the desire to improve, we are thrust into what is the start of the manga, the first scene with the teacher, it being distributed to the students. and the praise that they heap on Fujino for her kind of really witty and funny humor. This brings up something that I've absolutely wanted to talk about for so long, and I think another one of Fujimoto's absolute wins as a storyteller, and that's conveying a character without telling you anything about a character. There's really good examples of this, and a video I've always wanted to make is the best first episodes in anime, of which I would call things like Kill la Kill episode 1 or Princess Tutu episode 1, but also, of course, Chainsaw Man episode 1. And I think in all of those you get this idea of who the protagonist is by the actions that you see in the very first scene that you share with the character. Ryuko is a badass who doesn't take any shit. She bites a lemon in the opening scene of Kill la Kill. Duck is a mess, and we see her fall out of bed, and we also see her desire to dance with the prince, very, very obviously. And we're on board with both of those people right from the beginning. We want to see more of them and how they handle the conflicts. And the same thing with Denji at the start of Chainsaw Man. We are very aware of the type of person that would have to calculate the debt, and the debt that he owes, and this insurmountable debt, and how he considers it, and the situations that he goes through in order to deal with his debt in the first chapter of Chainsaw Man, or in the first episode of Chainsaw Man. And I think that's a testament to how well we can understand each other as human beings, and we as viewers sit and watch Denji struggle to share one piece of toast with Pochita, and we know we're not only logically connected with his story, but emotionally. Very quickly, we are there with him and on board with him. And it doesn't have to be positive, right? And I think that this scene really paints Fujino in this way of believable, but kind of an asshole. Because all we've seen so far is that she's diligent, right? But we get the creativity angle that she wrote this story, and that's very funny. She's very witty. She's very has a good command over what makes things funny, and she knows how to express that in her manga. But then in the responses that the children give to her, and then her responses back, no one says oh, Fujino's kind of haughty about how she, her skills. And no, all we see is Fujino say, I did it in 5 minutes, it's no big deal. And then with their arms behind her head in the most relaxed and proud body language possible. But these extended shots of the children's reactions give not only a kind of a universal acclaim that almost everybody is on board with what she's doing and sees it as laudable, but also by the same metric of how long are things held on screen that we saw earlier about the creative process, and that Oshiyama talks about in some of his interviews, and using that length of time to portray how much it's meaningful to the characters, or should be meaningful to us as the viewer understanding the character. There are a number of really great reactions all throughout the classroom. The other thing that's really important to establish at this point is that Fujino not only takes pride in it, but she defines her self-worth and her social worth by how well she can draw these comedy manga. This is a large part, and as a elementary school student, you don't have a fully formed concept of yourself and what you want to be and who you want to be. So things like this, if you're good at something and you get praised at something, whether it's piano or athletics or whatever, that becomes sort of your identity. I remember myself writing very cringy journal entries when I was that age of oh, I'm a good swimmer, and people have praised me for that, so that's how I define myself back then. It's very easy to see somebody with the comedic talent that Fujino, and by extension Fujimoto, had back early on in their life to make that part of their identity. And it's very integral for seeing that challenged later on in the film. Another thing here that is worthwhile to bring up is Fujino's line about, well, I'd have to sit at a desk and draw all day, and I don't know if I really want that. Because this brings up the other push and pull that we see when she rejects manga, in the futures where she doesn't draw manga and she's an athlete instead. Fujino doesn't have to define herself with this. And this directly contrasts with all the shots that we see of her sitting there and drawing throughout the rest of the film. It's not the only calling that she could have, or the only future that she could walk. And that's obviously in direct contrast to Kyomoto, who definitely feels like the only thing she could be doing is art. Another storyboarding tactic that I really love in this scene is having this shot right here with Fujino sandwiched between these two of her classmates that are giving her praise. Because it is a very standard directing trick, and it's even in the original manga, there's the panel that is exactly this, but having characters in the same shot together and having them positioned very close together tells you a lot just intrinsically about how the characters are feeling to each other. So being surrounded by this praise and then having those characters appear with the way the shot composition is of the desks on either side of her, and having the angle push them together shows us that this is very intimate, or that these characters are aligned in the same way, that they're together. And we see some direct contrasts to this much later in the film in much more stylistic ways. But that's just a simple thing to talk about. Well, you could have just the close-up of this one schoolmate talking and then a reverse shot of Fujino saying something, but that would break them apart. This is something we talked about in Disappearance when Kyon and Yuki are having their discussion in the changed world back and forth. They specifically cut the characters out of the same shot. This is the inverse of that. We put the characters together to show intimacy, to show alignment, to show a fostering of positive relationships. I love this next scene too because it immediately allows us to talk about the things left out, or the negative space, which is a huge theme of this, the brevity that I mentioned earlier in the video that I really want to bring back here. The scene with the sensei, much of the same, Fujino, haughty, kind of we're looking up at her as she looks down her nose at the camera, kind of. But also the arm across the body, that's body language for a little bit of insecurity, right? Of course, she has to play off the request by belittling the other person. That's such a, man, I don't know. That's just something I would never do, and I'd never think about in that way. But I think is more a thing that you do in Japan, where social status is much more important. Yeah, it just hurts to see, you know, which is good because it's supposed to hurt. You're supposed to be like, damn, that was a really, really haughty answer there, Fujino, but okay. Hey, we're not going to give her any shit because she's got a character arc to go through. She needs to learn humility, and we're about to see that too. And that's the beautiful thing, right? Like, we go from this haughty line, immediately next scene, her getting humbled by Kyomoto's art in the school paper. And this is the concept of brevity in this manga and in this anime, that they don't need to tell you anything else. There's no extraneous anything between here. Like so many other authors would just throw in some, like, I don't know, she goes out with their friends, or she I don't know, she does something. It would kind of like drag, even if it's reinforcing her haughtiness, even if it's reinforcing any element that we've already expressed here, it would still be unneeded. It really is a manga and a film that does not dally. We have seen all we need of Fujino being haughty and proud and receiving the praise, into bam, smash cut, here's the new papers, here's your comeuppance, here is the next arc of the character journey of the film. We are 6 minutes into the movie. That's wild, man. And that's what I love about Chainsaw Man 2, and that's what I love about Fujimoto just as a writer. It's like, God, it's like series composition, right? And I think this is a large credit of, you give it to like a script writer or something like that. But for a long-running show, for a serialized show, or I talk a lot about these, 50-episode, 200-episode Magical Girl shows, where there needs to be some type of structure, but it's in the service of getting an episode out every week. And something like Kill la Kill, where they literally, word of God, Otsuka said they did not have anything past episode 3 planned or written when they finished episode 1. And it's like, if you just have it all laid out, you know what you want to say, and you go back and you edit things together, and you cut out everything. I think it's a Stephen King quote where he's like, yeah, you write everything that you want and then go back and take out 2/3 of it. And that's exactly how you should tell a story. And it's so missing in so much media that we consume nowadays. It just feels so good to be able to talk about it and be able to point exactly to good series composition or movie composition, I guess it would be in this case, or just good pacing in your writing. Anyway, we're on to Kyomoto's animated scene. We don't get a full-on zoom in the same way, but we still do get this transition from the 4-panel comic that Fujino is looking at into this artistic style. Of course, the artistic style here matches the increased visual quality of Kyomoto's art in the manga. And we can clearly see through animation, even though it's translated into animation instead of still pictures, we still understand that this is a big step up in quality compared to the even well below Shin-chan level quality of the previous visual animated short that we saw earlier. I still think that Oshiyama manages to capture that this is an amateur, but then at the same time that this person is a much, much better artist than Fujino is. And through the translation of animation, there's not even that much movement in any of these shots in the short, but you still get that kind of potential vibe, that it's unrefined, but it's definitely clear that is much better animated than the previous one. And while the music and the quick shots give the idea of the panic that Fujino goes through, it conveys that without telling us, I still think it's funny that Kyomoto's art, even the little short that we see, clearly has no story. It has nothing there. It's just a series of 4 very pretty pictures. And yeah, that's a panic, right? And we have the scene upcoming where all the kids flip in their turn and they're like, oh my god, look how good this is. And no one says, yeah, but there's no story here. So after the contrast in animation, we cut back to the manga. We have the direct comparison between the 2 manga panels going down the page as Fujino's eyes go. And of course we have the dissonant piano chords that clearly indicate panic and her entire world being thrown out of whack. Just a very funny contrast between the serene music that was in the background of Kyomoto's animation segment. Again, there's no words here, but you understand by the music, by the animation, what Fujino is thinking. But I think what really sells it is the Fujimoto classic here of the shot of the mouth being open, which just like so many mouth shots in Chainsaw Man, having read all the way up to the stuff that's currently going on. Just Denji's slack-jawed face again and again just says so much, so many times throughout Chainsaw Man. But seeing that here, coupled with the shock, this shot right here, I think is probably one of my favorites, because it is this funny kind of Nichijou-esque, like, overreaction thing. Everything else fades to the background, and it's just this kind of Power and Kobeni after they do the car accident, that manga panel. Just humor, right? Yes, of course. But also look here. And this is like this really genius color theory that nobody would really pick up on unless you're going back specifically looking for it here. What is in the background here? What color do we put in the background here? It's purple. Now, Fujino, of course, associated with this kind of lime green that we see again and again for her hoodie. But do you know where the purple comes from? Of course you do. You've seen this movie already. God, I hope you've seen this movie already. Purple is always associated with Kyomoto. It's always her hoodie. Throughout the entire movie, we see her in that purple hoodie, and the only use of purple is really associated with Kyomoto because she also has a purple scarf when they're in the winter scenes. So purple directly corresponds. We're building this relationship already before the character's even been shown on screen. We have this very hard relationship with Kyomoto's like art, and specifically her exploring her art and getting better at her art with the color of purple. Now, the observant among you might know that's not the only part where purple is used, because after creating Shark Kick and everything, Fujino later in the story is wearing a similar purple kind of hoodie sweatshirt thing. So really, we've got this association with purple with the pursuit of artistic perfection and integrity. And this is kind of, contrasting with Fujino's way of interpreting art in this green color as being a social thing, a way to make people laugh, a way to get praise, all that kind of thing. And her being enveloped and surrounded in this one little throwaway joke shot by this artistic integrity of the regal purplish. Yeah, right? That's just like, man, if you're thinking about things on that level, and because obviously the manga's in black and white, this is a choice by Oshiyama, but like an informed one, right? To make Kyomoto purple and establish this semiotic all throughout the film. It's brilliant. And here's another Oshiyama flex. We see in the next shot this dolly zoom or vertigo effect shot going on where the background becomes larger and the character is zoomed in on to give this kind of like, freaking out or like feeling unstable effect. This is very similar to what we saw in the spinning intro sequence looking up at the moon to start the film. Of course you can't do this in a manga, but of course this is exactly what this feeling that is being conveyed in the manga, mostly by the reaction face shot, is in visual storytelling. In an animated sense, this would be the equivalent shot to really emphasize that feeling. And it's not even done there. Oshiyama gives us one more original interpretation of what this feeling is, with just the insanely massive classroom. And I love this one so much because it goes back to what we were saying about bending reality. What matters in this film is not anything objective, it is the subjectivity of the experiences of the girls. Something that's going to come up later when they rewrite reality to try to adjust to their stress and their post-traumatic stress disorder. We know as viewers that this is not really what is going on in Fujino's world, but we also know that this is exactly what it feels like for Fujino here. And the artistic interpretation trusting the viewer to understand that it's very simple because this is obviously not what's happening, but it's also so good as a show not tell example, and so good as a directing choice to convey what you need to convey without any words. And no music here too, just the chatter of the background of the students. Again, inspired choice. The next scene is yet another example of where Oshiyama honestly kind of improves on Fujimoto's original storyboards here with the manga. Oshiyama decides to set the next sequence differently than is in the manga. Because in the manga, we just see the fields, and the emphasis is on the futsuna, right? The line of, it looks ordinary. And then the farmer going by with his, I don't know, what do you call that, a rice planter, a combine, just seeing of the most normal thing possible, the most like, you're not going anywhere, get a job farming, your very plain thing. And that is still maintained in Oshiyama's interpretation of this story, but there's a very subtle directing trick. Well, no, it's actually not that subtle. We talked about it in Madoka Magica in episode 2, I believe it was, or 3. Because prior to the warped line of the boys saying Fujino's art looks normal in comparison, prior to that, Fujino is recalling the praise that she got from her mothers and other people in the different community members. And every time she recalls one of these memories, we get a shot of Fujino framed against the sky looking up. and it's dominated by blue. And this is a pretty apparent symbol for potential, or for growth, or for soaring. There's even a bird in the shot that we see that Fujino is taking that praise and saying, hey, I can be anything. I can go anywhere. I am limitless. I am expansive as the sky. But on all three of those praise shots, there's sky, and then on the contrast with the normalcy, with the bringing her back down to earth and saying, comparing her against someone else, small fish in a big pond thing, there's always going to be somebody better than you. Bam, you're right back down to looking at the ground. And then we get shots of the farmer and everything. So not only do we have that established, normalcy as what is Fujimoto's interpretation of it, but Oshiyama gives us the inherent sky and freedom associating that to the praise that Fujino receives. And this gives us a complete understanding of Fujino's mindset, like how her brain operates, that she needs that praise to be able to function. Now, is that healthy? Well, that's not a question for us to answer, right? And certainly the arc of the story is getting to a place where Fujino is doing her art for her art's sake and not to seek the praise of other people. Probably. We'll get to that later. But the idea is right now she is in this mindset. And it jives with everything that we've been shown, not told, prior to this. And we are, 8 minutes into the movie. I've been talking for 50 minutes now. We are 8 minutes into the movie, and we understand everything about this character, how she operates, what her goals and objectives are, what the conflict of the story is going to be. So then we get her decision. Again, the pacing so quick in this movie that we don't dwell on it for too long. And Fujino is not the type of person, and I would say by extension Fujimoto too, is not the type of person to dwell on inner turmoil. Instead, Fujino makes a decision almost immediately after we see her reflect on everything. And she chooses to accept the challenge and to study art. And this is how you write an engaging character, or one that people like and support. Because people that don't do things or just complain or sit inside themselves and mope, those are not people that other people enjoy being around or enjoy hearing stories about. We like people who take action and make decisions, even if that's a bad decision, which this may be. There's a large part of the story where that shows that, dedicating everything to art like Fujino is going to do is deleterious in some way. But we at least respect her for making this decision and going and doing something. I think it's a very easy way to get the audience behind your protagonist when you're telling a story. Frame everything in the context of what they are doing. Of course, the visual directing chicks on the decision are absolutely in line with everything you would expect. We have a close-up of Fujino audibly saying, "No way I'd ever allow that." And anytime you put the camera closer to a character's face, something is more important to them. I think they could have even gone a little closer, just right up on the eyes here. Then you also have the running to the left. Anytime a character moves, in a piece of animation especially, but just in visual narrative media in general, that is symbolizing some type of decision or motion or progress towards a goal. In Japan, we talked about this in The Adolescence of Utena. In Japan, you read top to bottom, right to left, traditionally, so every time you are moving to the left, you are making progress on something. That comes up multiple times throughout this film, and is exactly in line with everything that you would expect. Every type of escape sequence that you would like, see Adolescence of Utena or Disappearance of Ahari Suzumiya, Kyon does a similar thing where he runs to the left of the screen. And again, here in Look Back, we see the same exact thing. We see Fujino taking off to the left. And the final shot here, I will point out before one more point, is framed with Fujino on the bottom from the ground, shot very low, dominated by the expansive sky. Her decision is allowing her that type of ambition and freedom and movement towards her goal and potential. The other thing that I want to bring up here is that there's actually a number of shots of Fujino walking through a rice field, right? The rural place that I don't know actually where this is set. I should look that up. But there's a number of shots where we have this of Fujino walking through the thing, having her introspective moment out in nature. And this is, again, priming us for those other ones that will come up later. Even the split between Kyomoto and Fujino is set out in the distance, outside. And I suppose how I would interpret that is that this is a natural thing, right? If you frame something surrounded by all this nature, then it makes whatever's going on seem inherent and intrinsic as well. So this is Fujino at her most basic, that she is not destined, but predisposed to behave in this way. We'll end off this video talking about the montage. And again, montage is so core to how this was interpreted by Oshiyama, but also very prevalent in the manga. And I think here, this one's especially important because it introduces us to so many of the symbols that we need for later on. Specifically the art sketchbooks, right, that become a large symbol of how much time you have invested into becoming better at art. Also, this feels very personal in some degree, that this is like, out of all the autobiographical or semi-autobiographical elements of this story, this one really hits me as someone who has been there and done this. If this story was made or written by somebody other than a manga artist, then you wouldn't get such detail on this. You know, you would get more embellishment, or something like the currently airing thing done by MAPPA right now, where, yeah, they have elements of anime production, but it's fantasized, right? I think this is very grounded. Zenshu, that's what the anime is called. Yeah, it was mid. I don't know. Nakamura's song strikes me as plotting. There's this bum 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 undertone to the song. Over the melody, however, is hopeful and kind of gliding and soaring and gently increasing, but there's the undercurrent of repetition, of effort to this one. And I think it, man, conveys it so well in the absence of dialogue, or as a replacement for dialogue. And this, I think, was one of the first movies that has ever happened for me, where I'm not a music person so much, right? I can play a little guitar, but I like the lyrics because they really tell me how to feel. But this was the first time I really understood emotion through just the music by itself. And it was such a powerful experience for me, seeing that going on and like making this really pointed choice to embrace the method of a montage to deliver a message. As you watch this montage back again, I want you to think about where the cuts happen. They're not always, but most of them line up on the downbeat of Nakamura's music. So that's the idea that the music was planned before the storyboard timing was done. And I really like that idea because that's something that my favorite director, Junichi Sato, specifically said that he did all the time, was just put the piece of music down first and then direct and time the cuts to the beats on the music. And it really gives a force to it. It really makes you, the viewer, feel like, yeah. And then she drew these figure studies and they look kind of bad, but yeah. Then she did another one and another one and another one, right? We already are invested with Fujino, but here we're using the montage to become emotionally sympathetic to her, or on board with the effort. And that's the success of the montage, right? You don't need Eye of the Tiger, but Eye of the Tiger is a great example of being exactly on board with the character and fast forwarding through the really repetitive stuff. It's not that you get hyped up for Rocky in his training montage. It's that you understand the effort. You not understand mentally the effort, but you understand emotionally the effort behind what he's going through. And it's the exact same for Fujino's character drawing sketches here, as they very, very slowly start to improve. A couple more thoughts about the montage as we wind down. The manga pays exactly the same amount of reverence to this. The story up until now has been 10 pages. This montage takes up 5 pages. So 1/3 of the first, 10 minutes of runtime, that would be a 3 minute 30-second montage. So if you think, it's not 1-to-1 versus manga material translated into a different medium, but if you think about the emphasis that Fujimoto wanted to put on this training montage, it's very clear that Oshiyama took that and saw that this was a core element of adapting this manga. And also, I just think it's hilarious that the way you get better at drawing is by studying human anatomy. That's wild for me. I'm not an artist, and I do not know how to draw, but I think I have a couple stories related to this. First is when they were training the AI. So many of these companies don't want to deal with anything sexual, or, you can't tell ChatGPT to write you erotica or anything. It'll politely refuse. You have to trick it, So they're making image models, right? And they were like, oh, we're not going to have anything not safe for work in this image model. I think it was Stable Diffusion 3. And they said, oh, no. All of it's not in the training data. We're no naked people in the training data. Okay. And it turns out the model was absolute shit at drawing human beings in general, like even fully clothed human beings. And that's just wild to me that the AI would, just like a human, need to study the naked human body and human anatomy, the skeletons and everything, to be able to respectfully and accurately craft a clothed human being. Just absurd, and that's so cool, I think. This is also the same reason why all of your Japanese, any famous Japanese animator or artist drew pornography. It's like all of them. My favorite example is the Raita, the character designer for some of the Fate characters, as well as Valkyria Chronicles. Raita draws porn. He's an entire porn series about magical girls. It's like everybody started in porn because the first way to get good at drawing characters is to draw naked characters and know how to position arms and everything, right? Then you can do the clothes on top of them, and that comes later. My other story about this that I've never told anyone on the internet, and I will share it with you now because I think the statute of limitations has passed. In 2019, I went to Otakon and had the immense honor to talk to Yo Yoshinari. I talked to him in Japanese right after a trigger panel. I owned his art book, and I noticed a specific drawing of 2 feminine figures entwined. And somewhere on the internet, there was a little risque artwork of a naked Akko and Diana from Little Witch Academia floating around. And I asked Yo Yoshinari, I said, might these 2 figures in your art book perhaps have continued on to then be official erotic artwork, as he was the original creator of Little Witch Academia? And he told me not to share the answer. And I think that's where I'll leave you all for the end of this video. I do have a couple things that I want to say. I have a Patreon. I would very much encourage you to subscribe. God, if you listen to an hour of me talking, I'm going to make more. And also, please, it really helps me if you just click subscribe. Please also leave a comment on this video. If you're familiar with my previous breakdowns, most of the very interesting things that I said over the previous series were comments originating from you guys. So hit me with any correction, with any type of thought that you might have had, any spark that I've hit you with that ignited something within you that you wanted to share and think is meaningful and relevant. I read every single comment, I promise you, and respond to most of them. Thank you once again for joining me on this journey. I'm very excited to go through this together with you. So join us next time as we talk about the cost of dedicating yourself to something, and we actually introduce the second character in our show.